So welcome everyone. Thank you for coming on this beautiful day at during your what could be your lunch break to this meeting and presentation and workshop about virtual meeting accessibility. My name is Stephen Lazikas. I work at the Civic Engagement Commission. I am a white male with a beard and a bald head wearing glasses. I use he, him pronouns, but I just wanted to quickly welcome everyone to this workshop and to just quickly say thank you to Arthur Jacobs from the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities for taking the time to do this today. I also would just, if you could share in the chat your name and your borough and community board number with us so that we can just know where everyone's coming from today. And again, just thank you for coming. We're really excited about this, and I'll kick it over to Arthur so that you can get started. Thanks again.
Thank you, Stephen. Welcome, everybody. And yes, again, thank you for coming on your lunch hour and joining us for this presentation. Again, I'm Arthur Jacobs from the Mayor's Office for People with Disabilities. I'm MOPD's digital accessibility expert. I'm a white male in my mid-40s, blonde hair, blue eyes, and I am blind. We're just going to do a quick access check. This is our way of making sure everybody has what they need to fully participate in the presentation. So if I'm speaking too softly or too quickly, or there's something else that I can do to help you to understand, let me know. You can also ask questions in the chat. Stephen will be monitoring those and letting me know if we have any. We will also take questions at the end in case you don't remember or you want to ask then. At that point, at the end, you can just unmute yourself, say your name, and then I will acknowledge you and you can ask your question. We do have closed captioning available, automated closed captioning. So if you click the CC button in your Zoom window, you can access those captions. All right, so we will get started. Also, I will be describing any images in the slides. So just to give you an idea of our overall slide layout, in the upper left corner is the MOPD logo. In the upper right-hand corner is a colorful array of accessibility icons. The lower left is our Twitter handle, which is @NYC Disabilities. And the lower right-hand corner is our website, nyc.gov/disabilities. All right, so the presentation will cover the following main points. We're going to start with some disability basics. Then we're going to move into choosing accessible virtual spaces, then talk about promoting with inclusion in mind, then move into hiring accessibility professionals, setting up the technology, and then finish off with the accessibility during the meeting. So some language basics and language tips. You want to put the person first when you're speaking about people with disabilities. So a person with a disability rather than disabled person, or people with disabilities rather than the disabled. And then if you were talking about a specific disability, person who is blind, a person who uses a wheelchair, that sort of thing. And if you're not sure what words to use, you can just ask the person. I often prefer just go by Arthur. So you want to avoid outdated terms. So things like handicapped, crippled, retarded, crazy, special needs, wheelchair bound. These are all outdated terms that are no longer favored by the community. You want to just, for all of those, really, you can just say disabled, right? Or person with a disability, person who uses a wheelchair. Special needs is oftentimes used in DOE and talking about kids, so students with disabilities, that sort of thing. Victim, sufferer, physically challenged, differently abled. Differently abled is interesting because you do hear that and people think, oh, that's really more empowering. But that term was created by a person without a disability just to feel better about talking about people with disabilities. So we would just rather you use disability instead of differently abled, handy-capable, that sort of thing. Visually impaired, hearing impaired, it's really impaired that we have a problem with because that implies something is wrong, harks back to the medical model of disability, which really focuses on trying to make people more like, more normal, quote unquote, rather than just accepting the disability. All right, some of the relevant laws when we're talking about virtual accessibility and in particular virtual meetings. There's Title II and Title III of the Americans with Disabilities Act. Title II is relevant for public entities or government entities and requires that they provide people with disabilities access to their programs and services. And then Title III is for public accommodations, which is basically anything else that is available to the public, any non-governmental services or businesses. And that requires that they provide non-discrimination in their policies and allow access to people with disabilities. And then locally within the city, we've got Local Law 26, which mandates that websites are accessible for all NYC agencies, and Local Law 28 of 2016, which requires that information about the accessibility of a public meeting be included in any advertisements for that meeting. So including, well, we'll talk more about this. I'm not going to go into the details of that, but all right. So choosing an accessible meeting platform, some of the things to keep in mind. You want to make sure that the platform you're using is accessible. What do we mean by that? We mean that it is able to be used by somebody who's using a screen reader, which is something that blind people would use to access the meeting. Also, you want it to be keyboard accessible. So anybody who's unable to use a mouse can access the meeting. You want to make sure that it supports captioning, both live and, well, live or automated. We prefer live captions. So a human typing the captions as opposed to automated. And then also support for ASL, American Sign Language interpreting, and then support for things like chat, Q&A, the ability to raise your hand, that sort of thing, so that you've got that interaction within the meeting. So some platforms that we recommend, and these are kind of in order from based on preference. We find that Zoom is the most accessible platform that we've come across. It has the most flexible and robust accessibility features, both meetings and webinars. Next in line to that is Google Meet and then Microsoft Teams. And Google Meet and Teams are improving their accessibility. Certainly they've gotten better since the start of the pandemic, but Zoom really has taken the lead with regard to accessibility, we feel, in the way that they allow for the accessibility of a meeting. We want some recommendations for setting up your meeting. You want to ensure that you've enabled captioning. So if you go into the settings within that meeting platform, you want to make sure just overall captioning is available and turned on. Sometimes that has to be done before you start a meeting, so it can't be done in the meeting. Also, you want, we recommend that you have mute upon entry turned on because it just facilitates a smoother meeting. So you don't have a bunch of noise at the very beginning, or people don't realize that they're unmuted when they're joining the meeting and there's a bunch of background noise and then they have to try to mute, and it can be disruptive. And if you're doing like a webinar type format, you want to make sure that you send panelist invites to any accessibility professionals that you've hired so that they can access the meeting and right away and be able to set up and be ready to go when the webinar starts. All right, so let's talk about promoting your meeting in an accessible format. So you want to make sure to reach people with disabilities online, and you have to do that, you have to make sure that the content is accessible. So when we talk about the content, we're talking about things like registration forms, event pages, flyers, documents, and slides, any social media posts and videos that you put out. And we have guides for each of these available on our website, nyc.gov/accessibility guides. And don't worry about trying to write these down. You're going to get this deck, and so you'll have access to all these links. So some digital accessibility best practices. You want to make sure that your documents, emails, and social media posts are accessible. And when we talk about the accessibility of those, we're talking about things like having alt text for images. Alt text is a tag or an embedded description of that image so that a person using a screen reader can get a description of the image so that they know what is being presented to them rather than it just saying image 12345.jpg, right? Which is not helpful at all. You want to make sure that web pages and emails have tags for headings, lists, and links. So that semantic tagging within those electronic documents. That includes Word documents and PDFs as well. Ensure that the color contrast is accessible and that you use accessible fonts. So the color contrast minimum is 4.5:1, and accessible fonts means that you're using a sans serif font. Sans serif, think of Arial, Helvetica, Verdana. Oftentimes when you look at the list of fonts that are available to you, you'll even see the word sans in the name. So for instance, Lucida Sans, that is a sans serif font. And that sans serif fonts are just easier to see and to read and process, what letters are what. To check the color contrast, going back to that 4.5:1, you can use a color contrast checker. We recommend the WebAIM color contrast checker. You can just Google color contrast checkers. They're all pretty good. WebAIM gives you additional information and allows you to adjust the colors to find the perfect contrast ratio based on the color scheme that you want to use. So that's very helpful. Make sure to use plain language. You can go to plainlanguage.gov for recommendations on what that looks like. And then make sure your documents are available in an accessible format. So accessible PDFs or Word documents, accessible slide decks, that sort of thing. And again, we have guides on all of these available at nyc.gov/accessibility guides. Event pages and RSVPs. So you want to make sure that you use accessible event pages. Some examples are Eventbrite, Google Forms, pretty accessible. Facebook, also Microsoft Forms is pretty accessible as well. You want to avoid using time limits if there's ticketing or registration involved. If you do have to have a time limit that's just associated with the platform you're using, try to, if you're able to make it so that that time can be extended or even turned off by the user. And then give people an option to register via email or phone as well. So really, when you make things accessible, it means also providing multiple ways that something can get done. So not that you have to go to a website in order to register, but that you can do it by email or by phone as well. Social media accessibility, we talked a little bit about this, but you want to make sure that any images that you're posting in your social threads are include alt text. And this is, again, a written description of the image through the social media platform. And it's not something that's part of the post, but is actually an embedded description that is done through the programming of the platform in order to allow that to be available to a screen reader. Alt text is supported by Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and LinkedIn. And to get more information about how to actually add that alt text information in those different platforms, you can go to the Accessible Social Media Guide, and it will give you the step-by-step on how to do that. A good image description covers who, what, when, where, and why. And why actually should be the first question. Your description really should be colored by the reason why you're using the image. There's something that you're trying to get across by using this image, and that needs to come clearly through the description. And then some additional best practices with social media. You want to use camel case, and that's, I did the hashtag there as an example of camel case. So capitalizing each word when you are typing it out without spaces. So this is for URLs, hashtags, anything like that. The reason for that is, one, it makes it easier visually to read. But two, it also is a signal to the screen reader that even though there aren't spaces, these are separate words. And so instead of trying to pronounce it as one word, it will actually give it as the separate words that are made up within that non-spaced, hashtag or URL. And then one of the things we've noticed, especially in Twitter, that people are doing nowadays is using ASCII characters. This is a way of kind of adjusting the font, quote unquote, in these platforms. But those ASCII characters actually to a screen reader come across as, let's say you're using, I don't know, a Cyrillic, one of the Cyrillic letters, because it looks cool, that particular letter looks cool that way. And so, but when you do that, it's not going to make it, pronounce the word, it's just going to read that character. So it's going to be Cyrillic S, Cyrillic R, Cyrillic T, it's not going to actually pronounce the word, and it makes it very difficult to read and understand. So avoid using, or really don't use ASCII characters. Also, and it's not here, it should be, don't use all caps unless you're talking about acronyms or abbreviations. All caps is difficult to read, and it should really only be used for abbreviations and acronyms like ASCII. All right, videos. If you're going to be playing any kind of video within your presentation or meeting, you must include captions for the deaf or hard of hearing community. You want to make sure that it has audio description for the blind and low vision community. And to do either of those, you can look at our audio description and captioning guide to get guidance on how to do that. All right, so advertising accessibility. Everyone should include accessibility information. So this goes back to local law 28 I mentioned. You should include accessibility information in the advertising for public events. So what does that look like? You're going to indicate which accommodations will be just automatically provided, right? So let's say you're doing a Zoom meeting and you know that you're going to have an ASL interpreter and you're going to use the automated captioning in Zoom. So you want to say, this is going to be a virtual meeting. You're going to make sure you say the platform. So via Zoom, we're going to provide an ASL interpretation and use Zoom's automated captioning. So that should be included in the advertisement so people know what kind of accommodations are going to just automatically be there. Then you also want to provide a way for people to request additional accommodations. And you want to make sure that they know who to reach out to. So it's best if you provide an actual name and then provide both a phone number and an email address to contact that person. And make sure you give the deadline. And we recommend 3 to 7 days before the event. We've noticed that it used to be 2 to 3 days, but we've noticed that especially for certain kinds of accommodations where you need to actually hire like an ASL interpreter or a captioner, they need a little more lead time these days because they've gotten a lot of these virtual meeting requests. And so, they really look for like a week in advance. And so you want to make sure to check with those folks prior to setting the deadline so you know what to expect or what you need to make sure to ask for from the audience. Possible accommodations that a person may request. So you should be prepared to provide each of these. American Sign Language interpretation, communication access, real-time translation or CART. This is a live captioner, so a human captioner. Accessible electronic documents, so accessible Word documents or PDFs, accessible slide decks, should all be provided. And just a little note on slide decks, a lot of people tend to turn their slide decks into a PDF before they distribute them. We actually recommend you don't do that because that process doesn't really provide a very accessible PDF without going in and remediating the PDF and doing a whole lot of work on it. It's best just to provide the actual slide deck, again, assuming that you have created that in an accessible way. And I refer you to the accessibility guides page that I've mentioned before to get details on how to create accessible documents and slides. All right, hiring accessibility professionals. When we say accessibility professionals, we're talking about ASL interpreters, captioners, cart providers, as well as audio describers. So these are the three kinds of professionals you may need to hire for your meeting. These are links. The first two are links to lists of providers in the area. There are some audio description providers on our website. So if you go to our resources page on the MOPD website, you will find some information about audio describers as well. All right, so preparing the technology. You want to make sure that you, at the very least, you log in 15, 20 minutes before the start of the meeting, just to make sure that everybody are set to go. All of your accessibility professionals are there and have what they need and are set up. If you're using ASL, oftentimes they will actually ask that you get there 30 minutes before. It just depends. So you want to verify that with them. Make sure everything is just ready to go. If this is a new technology, so for instance, if you're just going, oh, we usually use WebEx, which by the way is very inaccessible. And so, okay, well, now we're going to switch to Zoom, but we don't really know Zoom. You're going to want to give yourself a little bit more time, right? Maybe even go a day or two before, have a little practice session. Make sure you understand all the features, how to activate everything, and make sure that everything's working properly. And if the professionals can also be there to make sure that they are aware of everything and that everything's working, that would be good too. Though most of the time nowadays, especially, these professionals are used to working on these platforms, and so they are familiar with it. So it's just a matter of you familiarizing yourself with the technology. And then make sure that the presenters and accessibility professionals download the platform ahead of time. You can tell when we created this. This was very early in the pandemic. That's probably not something you have to worry about so much anymore, especially with the mainstream platforms like Zoom and Teams and all that. Some expectations for the presenters. You want to make sure that this is also something that you can do in that 15, 20 minutes before the meeting. Make sure you talk with the presenters and make sure they all understand some of these expectations. So only one person should be speaking at a time. You should say your name and affiliation before speaking, especially the first time that you speak. That helps not only the people who are attending the meeting, but also helps the accessibility professionals, because then they can pass that along and understand who you are and let the folks know. You want to make sure that you're reading slide titles and describing any images in the slide. And also make sure that the presentation itself is accessible. So the actual slide deck is accessible. And again, here's a link to Accessible Slide Decks and Presentations Guide that will give you all of the best practices for how to do that. All right, and this is actually our last slide, and it's interesting that it is, because we started out with the access check, but this is something that we like to do at the beginning of our meetings. Again, just to help make sure everybody knows what accessibility options are available and that they have everything they need, to fully participate. So, it's a check-in regarding your speed and volume, like I did. Want to acknowledge the accommodations and how to access them. This is, how do you mute? How do you pin the screen of an interpreter? How do you turn on or off captioning, that sort of thing. Describe also how to ask questions, right? If you want to use the Q&A function or the chat function or the hand raising function, right? All those different things you can decide, how you want to run that meeting, but you just want to make sure people know what to expect and how to participate. Make sure that you're describing any images within the presentation, and make sure to let folks know, again, how to ask questions and go over just the general etiquette for the presentation. Like, if you're not speaking, please stay muted. Most people know this by now, but you never know. So, all right. So thank you. I'm again, Arthur Jacobs. Here's my info. You will be getting the slide deck. So again, you don't need to jot this down quickly, but we can take questions now. So if you have a question, feel free and type it in the chat. You can raise your hand, your Zoom hand, or you can just unmute and say your name and I'll acknowledge you.
I have a question, Arthur. This is Hillary from the CEC.
Hi, Celery.
Thanks so much for this presentation. It was really interesting. I also went to your accessible documents one. Was it last week or the week before? I'm curious, in the Google Slides, I guess is what I usually use to make my slide decks. For people with screen readers, is there anything, I mean, after having listened to the presentation, I've learned a bunch, but is there anything specific that I need to make sure to turn on or enable, apart from just not saving it as a PDF and sending it out that way, in order to make it readable by someone using a screen reader? I feel like I remember from last week you mentioned something and I'm forgetting what it was.
Yeah, Google Slides, I don't think has the same level of customization that you have in PowerPoint.
Okay.
So like for the reading order, I'm not sure there's a way to adjust that. I would say at a basic level, make sure that you're using the built-in templates. So built-in like titles and
Right.
text, and then making sure you're using accessible fonts and checking color contrast. I
Right.
would say those are the basic things. And you're absolutely right. At Google, actually, the Google Suite generally does an even worse job of creating accessible PDFs because it even if you make a perfectly accessible Google Doc or Google Slide, it will wipe all of that accessibility out when it creates the PDF and just creates an untagged PDF. And so, yeah, it's definitely better to share the document directly.
Got it. Right. So just as a follow-up, you know, if I've got somebody who's requesting the document ahead of time and it's in a Google Slide format, would the best way be to say, ensure that, right, I'm using the headings and using the list formats and things like that, and then just send them the link like ahead of time, ahead of the presentation?
Yeah. And the
Okay.
nice thing about the Google Suite is you can make that link so they can just view it instead of being able to edit it. So that provides the security, so they're not changing anything, but
Right. Sure.
they'll still have access. So
Okay, great. Thank you so much. This was very helpful and insightful.
Yeah. Any other questions? I will just going off of that question regarding Google Suites. If you're creating a Google document and it's really not possible for you to share the document itself, but you're going to be distributing it as a PDF, the best way to do that is to export it from the Google Doc Arena platform into a Word document and then converting that Word document into a PDF, because it will save all the accessibility features you put into it going from Google Doc to Word doc, and then Word will create the accessible PDF as long as you export it or save it as a PDF and not print it as a PDF. And again, all of that is talked about in our accessibility guides on our website. All right, I'm going to assume that everybody's busy chomping on their burgers and salads and don't have any questions. Again, you are welcome to reach out to me via email if you do come across a question or think of something later. We will also be doing this presentation again later this week, so you're welcome to come back this Thursday evening, and we will be sharing the slide deck. So.
Yes, this is Stephen Lazikis. Thank you so much, Arthur, for taking the time to share all of this with us today. And thank you all for showing up. We really appreciate everyone's attendance. And if you found this helpful, please share this with your fellow community board members, because yes, on Thursday evening at, I think it's 6 p.m. We will be having
Mhm.
another round of this workshop so that you and your colleagues can become better acquainted with accessible meeting formats. And so just thank you all again. Seeing no further questions, I think I'm going to end the recording and let you all get back to your day. Thank you so much for showing up. And hopefully we will see you again for other trainings that we have in the future. And thanks again, Arthur.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Arthur. See you next
Yep.
time.
All right. Thank you.